Happy October, everybody. You know what that means? Halloween. Turkey season. Come on. Anybody excited about turkey next week at Thanksgiving? Anybody excited about tofurkey next week at Thanksgiving? Nobody does tofurkey? Okay. For all our vegetarian friends, if you don't partake in the blessed bird that is the turkey, that's okay. I'm sure there's, corn and beets and carrots and other things that you can eat that day. I love October for many different reasons. October is the changing of the seasons. October is like 1 month into this new rhythm when you got the kids at school and all the routines starting and all the stuff that you said that you would sign up for over the summer, and then it's all happening and you're going like, why did we do this to ourselves? That's what's happening. That fitness regime that you were like, oh my goodness, I'm going to get into shape. And you're like, oh, that just fell by the wayside because Thanksgiving's coming and I'm going to overeat then. October represents a whole bunch of different things. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like a rubber band come October. I feel stretched in places that I didn't know that I'd be stretched. Have you ever seen those rubber bands before, right? How many of you have played with them as a kid? How many of you have intentionally hurt another person with a rubber band before? Maybe you just shot it at them like this, right? You're like, haha. Say their name and just be like, boom, gotcha. The truth is, sometimes we feel more like rubber bands than we care to admit. Sometimes life happens and we feel, oh, hey, that was a good one. We feel so stretched thin, not just to the point of can't stretch anymore, but to the point that we're going to break. This is going to hurt, by the way. We break. And so this month of October, what we're going to do is we're going to actually dig into a series called Stretched Thin. Because we feel like as human beings, whether it's our emotional well-being, our mental well-being, our physical well-being, or our spiritual well-being, there are times, there are moments, there are seasons where we feel a little stretched too thin. At the moment of breaking, at the moment of being overwhelmed, at the moment of being undone. And so we want to take a biblical look at what does it mean to respond like Jesus in those moments. To follow his invitation and his call, to come and know him, to understand that his yoke and his burden is light. That doesn't seem like a stretched thin reality. This seems like an invitation to hope, an invitation to joy, an invitation to wholeness once again. And I don't know anybody that wouldn't love to feel whole in the moment. Today we're going to start our series, the first of two parts. We're going to look at our mental health and well-being, and we're going to be focusing specifically this morning on the topic of anxiety. From a biblical perspective, anxiety. Now here's what anxiety is defined as. Anxiety is a feeling of unease, like worry or fear, that can be both, all three of these things, mild, moderate, or severe. It's a feeling of unease, like worry or fear, that can be mild, moderate, or severe. Every single one of us has felt an expression of this feeling before. If I were to invite one of you to come and join me on stage and talk in front of people, how many of you would feel a slight feeling of unease? Let's be honest. That's one of the most paralyzing things and fears that people have, is talking in front of people. Statistically speaking, in the nation of Canada, 20% of our population struggles with anxiety from a moderate to severe perspective. Let's put that into perspective here this morning. Let's say that we had 400 people here. 20% of 400 is 80. 80 people in this space would struggle, according to the stats, generalizing, with anxiety from a moderate to severe perspective. If you had 80 people in our space, the rest of us, 320, if we weren't a part of that 80, are probably connected to one of those 80. So whether you yourself struggle with anxiety or not, this is a topic that impacts you wherever you go. You might see it at school. You might have a classmate that has special allowances during exams to manage their anxiety. You might see it in your workplace, where people take stress leave. That is a form of anxiety. You might see it in your household when you know you got to bring up a topic like the budget, and you start talking about the budget, and you know it's going to make people anxious. And the thing about anxiety is when we feel it, we can lash out in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes we can lash out in anger. Sometimes we can lash out in silence. Some of us are like, that would be the best version of anxiety. But where do we go with it? What do we do when we encounter it personally, or when we see it in our family, in our friends, in our teammates, in our world? What do we do when we feel a little stretched thin? I'm going to share with you a story that Jesus told his disciples. It's from the book of Luke, chapter 15. If you got a Bible, please turn there with me. We're going to dig into it together. It's a very familiar story. If you've been around church for a while, you might have heard this story, and you might be like, what does it have to do with anxiety? I'm going to share with you these three specific characters from this text, and each one of them struggles with a form of anxiety. When you read into the text and understand the multiple layers and this feeling of unease and worry and dissatisfaction, you can see that they, too, just like us, wrestle with this heavy-weighted emotion and mental health well-being. Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11, I'm going to read all the way through, including verse 32. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had two sons. This younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed up all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. And his son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you. I am no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. And kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and is now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working, and when he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf, and we are celebrating because of his safe return. And the older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. And his father came out and begged him. But he replied, All these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in all the time you gave me, and in all of that time you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. His father said to him, Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found. Familiar story maybe to some of us. Three main characters, a father and two sons. And here's how each one of them are interconnected to anxiety. Let's start from the younger son's perspective. There are three primary ways that anxiety can manifest itself. There's social anxiety, there's performance anxiety, then there's general anxiety, and I'll define each one of those. Social anxiety is when we are deathly afraid of what people think of us. We think that they're going to be judging us. We think that they're constantly forming opinions about what we say, about what we do, about what we don't say, about what we don't do. We are constant state of flux going like, oh my goodness, did I say something good in that conversation? We psychoanalyze ourselves to death at times when we are severely or moderately struggling with social anxiety. And sometimes the ramifications of this manifests itself in various ways. In this younger son, I see the picture of somebody who's very socially anxious. He grows up in what seems to be a pretty stable home. He's got a father, he's got a brother. There's some wealth in the home. There's some stability in the home. So much so that he can ask his father for half of his share of what would be his when his father dies, and his father agrees to it. That means he's got a lot to go around. He gives a portion to his younger son, and then what does he do with it? He moves away, and he tries to buy connections and friendships everywhere that he can. Social anxiety is one of those things that surfaces in our relationships all over the place. Sometimes we are doing stuff or not doing stuff because we would desperately want to connect with people. I have had conversations with people that they've said, you know what, I really want to develop a friendship and a connection, but I don't know how to have a conversation. And I say to them, why don't you say the first thing that just comes into your mind? And they're like, ooh, that's not a good idea. I don't trust myself, and I don't trust another person's response. What we see in this younger son is somebody that's trying to buy his way forward relationally. Sometimes we do that with our own stuff. Not just our money, we do that with our things, we do that with our talent. We create boundaries and barriers. You can know this part of me, but you can't know the full deal. We serve, we cook, we clean, desperately wanting people to see and notice us, all the while wondering if they do and why it matters. This anxiety can ramp up inside of us. It's one of the things, as you read different studies, psychological studies post-pandemic, it's one of the things that's surfacing more and more and more in our culture and in our world. It's like a top that's spinning out of control. It wouldn't surprise me that 20% jumped to 40% in a decade. We've lost the ability to understand and interact with each other based on how we're different and how we're similar. And so we try to mask our relational desire in various ways. This younger son was the life of the party. He kept things going. He had all the resources until he had none. So many of us are desperate to connect with people that we forget to create depth in our connections with people. You might have 5,000 followers on your social media, but how many of them truly know what makes you tick? How many of them truly know what you desire, what you value? And even asking yourself those questions, if you start to get anxious, you might be wrestling with social anxiety. Then you've got this older son. Maybe some of you can identify with this older son, the steady Eddie, let's call him. He's always there with his dad, always doing what he's told, always following through. His integrity is intact, all of these things, and what happens? His younger son, his younger brother, his father's youngest son, the one that squandered half the wealth, comes home one day and dad throws him a party. And the first thing that you find out is this older son gets angry. I wonder if he asked himself this question or variation of it. Haven't I done enough? Haven't I done enough? Haven't I earned my place enough? If you find yourself asking that question, you might wrestle with performance anxiety. Now, performance anxiety shows up when you've got a task to do and you get really nervous. I remember one time when I was learning piano. Yep, I learned piano. As a young child, we were doing a showcase in the local mall. Yes, they had a mall where I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Saskatchewan. We had to do something for entertainment. And they had the piano in the middle of the mall, and I was required to perform 2 of the songs that I had been rehearsing. I remember taking the first steps away from the crowd that had surrounded, the crowd was like 12 people, the crowd that had surrounded the piano. And you can feel your hands shake a little bit. You get nervous. But then I did what I had prepared to do. I performed those songs. Sometimes we perform because we want to be seen. Just hang out with little kids. They want to perform for you all the time. Hey, Dad, look at this. Hey, Dad, look at this. You're standing on one leg. Flamingos do that. Like, hey, Dad, look at this. No, don't do that. That happens too. We perform. We want to be seen. You got this older son who's doing everything exactly the way his father told him. But what's missing is the depth of connection once again with his father's heart. He's doing all the right things. He's spinning all the right plates, but he's missing the point. For some of us, we get nervous when we are on, when we're invited to perform, whether that's a job-related task, something new that we haven't done before. A little bit of nervousness, that's healthy. Nervousness to the point where we can no longer function, that's when anxiety takes over. Performance anxiety, we don't know what to do in the moment. There should be a rush of exhilaration if you're planning to cliff jump at least 10 feet into water, which you hope is deep enough that you won't break anything. That should be a little bit unnerving, especially if you decide to throw a backflip into the mix or a gainer or anything else. You should be a little bit nervous when you desperately want to tell that other person that you have been dying to tell that you've got a little micro crush on them. It's not a micro crush, it's a major crush. But you don't want them to know that yet. It's healthy to be a little bit nervous. When it becomes unhealthy is when it blinds us to the reality that this older son had a dad who loved him and his brother was lost and was now found. When our anxiety blinds us to what is actually true, it's become a problem. I'm doing all of this stuff. Isn't it good enough? And the truth is, Jesus has already said to you, you are enough. You are enough. He's more concerned about our being than our doing. Our doing needs to flow out of our being, and this older son forgot that formula. He said, I do, therefore I am. Instead of I am, therefore I do. So you've got this social anxiety, you've got this performance anxiety, which shows up in various ways, big things that are asked of us, things that we've maybe never done before, and it could paralyze us. Then you've got this other form of anxiety. It's called general anxiety. And you guessed it, it means exactly what you think. You're anxious about everything. And I can't help but think, being a father myself, as I read this story, and you've got this dad who's got one son with him and one son far away, doesn't have text messaging, can't track him on Find My iPhone or any other device, not knowing if he's healthy, if he's okay, if he's been hurt, if people notice him, if people love him, respect him, they're compassionate, if he's got everything that he needs to succeed, not knowing any of that, he's sitting and he's waiting. He is waiting for his son to come home every single day. How do you know that, Jason, every single day when it doesn't say that exact phrase in that text? Then how is he waiting on the day his son comes home? If he isn't waiting every single day before then, how does he know it's that day when his youngest son's going to finally go home? I think he's anxious. I think he's nervous, going like, I wonder if I will ever see him again. General anxiety manifests itself when all of the things in our world seem too much for us to handle. And it can overwhelm us, and it can weigh us down, and it can actually cause us to go into isolation. Because the question and the thought of like, is today going to be the day where this pain overwhelms me, is just too much. Now, the cool part about this story is there is a party and a celebration and an opportunity to connect. An opportunity to know freedom. And I think far too often in our world and in our culture, what ends up happening is we're supposed to just deal with it. Learn to live with whatever is happening to us or around us or even inside of us. And the journey towards healing actually starts with awareness. The biblical word for that is the word conviction. Recognizing our place in this world, recognizing our opportunity in front of us. When it comes to understanding who Jesus is, it starts with recognizing that he is so much more than we will ever be. Putting him in his right place as Lord of all creation. Recognizing that he's not only who he says he is in every single way, he's more than that. That's where it starts. That's where it begins. And as we wrestle through our various expressions of anxiety, it's putting it in its right place. Psychologists call it grounding techniques. When you're becoming anxious and nervous about something, you're supposed to ground yourself, root yourself in what you know to be true. Sometimes it can be as easy as just making sure that you're awake and not having a nightmare. Sometimes it is running through your favorite lyrics of a song that means something to you. But for a follower of Jesus, it starts with recognizing who he is. You're not alone in your anxiety. You're not alone in your unknown scenarios. You are present with a risen King who can show you everything that you need in that space. Now, the journey of awareness, it takes a lot of time, particularly depending on your default setting. If you're more like me, you need a lot of reminders of where you are, of whose you are, of why you are. You need a lot of reminders that you're not alone in the middle of your storm. You need a lot of reminders that you aren't crazy. The journey forward into healing starts with Jesus. If that's something that you're curious about, want to have a deeper conversation, you can find me after our service today or send me an email if you're online, jason@croad.ca. We'll talk to you more about that. But specifically this morning, I want to zone in a little bit more about anxiety. What do we do when it surfaces inside of us? What's our roadmap forward? How do we handle it? How do we live? How do we thrive in the middle of it? Book of Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 says something like this. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, with prayer and thanksgiving, present your requests to God. First part of that sentence is tough. Don't be anxious about anything. Well, I failed. Anxious about something. So oftentimes we don't keep reading. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, which means in all ways, at all times, in all things, prayer and thanksgiving, present your requests to God. It's right-sizing. It's grounding ourselves. Maybe it seems odd that a pastor would tell you the journey towards healing starts with Jesus. It shouldn't seem odd, but that's where it begins. Sometimes it's incremental progression. Sometimes it's an instantaneous thing. That awareness piece, that recognition of who we are. There's some other pieces of that healing journey that I just want to highlight, describe for you. First, after recognizing where you need to start, journeying into your anxiety, where it comes from, where it stems from with Jesus, it's then learning to define all the feelings associated with your anxiety, because there are more than one. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's being overwhelmed. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's bitterness. Sometimes it's a combination of those things and maybe other feelings that you've never felt before or haven't had language for. And sometimes what's really helpful is having a guide. You've got Jesus with you, and then others who understand who you are, who love you to the depths of your soul, who can walk with you into that space. See, the truth is you don't have to suffer alone. When we bring that part of us into the light, it does not mean that we are unworthy. It means we're human. And understanding who we are allows us, again, that awareness to continue to move forward into the next layers of hope and healing that God has. Sometimes the pathway forward with anxiety is learning to be assertive with your feelings. Not only understanding what they are, but then making a pathway forward, making some decisions. A lot of our anxiety can stem from decisions that we just haven't made. This older brother did not make the decision to love his younger brother, even though his younger brother returned. He made the decision instead of I'm going to be bitter and angry and frustrated with him because I did everything right, he did everything wrong, and God still loves us both. Sometimes it's with our nutrition. Seriously. Our physical anatomy affects our mental health and well-being. And sometimes it's what we eat. If you're always eating garbage and trash, you're always going to feel like garbage and trash. This isn't me telling you to get rid of the turkey next week and eat only vegetables. There's something that I noticed in my life about 5-6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, 7. When we moved from Calgary to Central Alberta, I started noticing that my mood and my feelings were affected by the weather patterns. And I was like, this is odd, never happened to me before in my life. I didn't know and I didn't understand that seasonal affective disorder is something that happens. There are 25 less sunny days in Red Deer than there are in Calgary. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that affects you? It affects me. So you know what I learned along the way? A little bit of vitamins is okay. Little B12, little vitamin D, and on those gloomy days, Jason doesn't feel gloomy. Weird. Nutrition. Some of us are like, I feel tired all the time. Maybe you should go see your doctor. Maybe you need an iron infusion. I share these things because there are multiple steps forward in your pathway towards healing. Sometimes they're incremental, sometimes they're instantaneous. They start with Jesus and going like, hey, I've noticed there's something up with me. Have you noticed there's something up with me? And he's like, oh, I've noticed there's something up with you. You start there. And maybe he's like, hey, that thing that you buried that happened to you when you were 7 years old, it's time to talk about that. Yeah, I don't want to go there. Or it's the gentle reminder of like, you know what? You're going to have to start moving, not just walking 15 steps a day. Try to build that up. Or maybe he's going to say, you know what? This friend that's come into your life, you can actually trust them. I know all those other ones you can't trust. They've hurt you, but this one, they're okay because I've sent them to you. Sometimes it's recognizing that additional health concerns can impact our anxiety. When we get a diagnosis that we weren't planning for, it's going to impact us emotionally. I don't care how strong you are going to be impacted. You might start out feeling numb, asking yourself the question, I can't believe this is happening. You might move into, what am I going to do? You might move from that into like, is everyone going to be okay if I'm no longer here? It can ratchet up that quickly, in milliseconds. And so sometimes it's being aware of additional health concerns might contribute to your overall well-being or lack of well-being when it comes to your mental health. Again, starting with awareness, asking Jesus, is this me? Talking to your medical health team. If you haven't seen your doctor in 25 years, start there. I know it might take you 25 years to get your appointment. Better now than 25 years from now. Sometimes it's recognizing that medication isn't a failure. It doesn't mean that you don't have enough faith. Like if God doesn't heal you in the moment, doesn't mean that you're unworthy. Doesn't mean that you're not significant. Doesn't mean that you're unseen. Doesn't mean that he wants to punish you. Life is a challenge. And unfortunately, this older son, he just didn't see that. He just set up a barrier in opposition. My younger brother over there, I'm over here. He's the favorite. Good for him. Man, I wish he'd just go away. And sometimes something like meditation will help. I'm not talking about meditation like our culture talks about meditation. I'm talking about biblical meditation. Learning to focus our hearts and our minds on Scripture. There are stats out there, various research groups that show the more time that you spend in Scripture individually, not just hearing somebody talk about it, the more stable you will be, your emotional equilibrium. Your anxiety will fade. Your desire to medicate with your addiction will fade. Your desire to overeat will fade. The threshold on a weekly basis for where Scripture starts to actually infuse us and help us with those things is actually engaging with it 4 times. In a 7-day stretch, 4 times. Doesn't talk about 4 hours. Doesn't talk about 4 minutes for each time. Just says 4 times. So if you're like, well, I listen to Jason and he talks a lot on Sundays, so that's 1. Okay, you need to find 3 more. What are you filling your mind with? Like, what other show do we have to binge watch? We can find time in our space to connect with the thing that will actually ground us. Particularly if we believe that the Bible is true. So I get it if you're like, well, I don't even believe the Bible is true, so why would I read it? Why don't you read it and find out for yourself? We always criticize what we don't know. Sometimes we have to get to know something before we criticize it. Get to know another person, we have to get to know another movement before we criticize it. Those are just some tips and some tricks and some ideas and thoughts on this pathway forward. But if Jesus isn't in your health plan, you will always be searching for what's next. Now, having Jesus in your health plan doesn't mean it's going to be completely smooth sailing all of the time. Sometimes there'll be challenging questions that you have to answer on a personal level. Habits you have to change, opinions you have to change, people you need to love. But other times, the things that have shackled us for years will no longer have power over us. Because they're exposed to the light. And in the light, there's freedom. And in the darkness, there's only pain.